Oh, Ethan, can you change your link so I can I can see it, right? But can you change it so I can add comments?
Um, I did change it so that like you can edit, but like
Oh, that's kind of funny then.
Okay, so, oh, I forgot to do the drill. Okay, I'll find the drill later. But today we're going to be talking about case writing practice. And wait, everyone can see my screen, right? Okay, well, I can't see anyone, so
yeah,
I'll
I
take that
can.
as a yes. So let's first talk about common problems with cases. Okay, well, actually, let's first talk about like review some of the terms once again, so everyone doesn't forget. So a basic argument consists of uniqueness, link, warrant, and impact. So uniqueness is what is the problem and why is it worse or better in the status quo? And why does only your side solve for the problem? So for example, if the resolution is like the US should put more money into counterterrorism, someone would say like the uniqueness would be terrorism has increased 100% in the past 2 years. And that's how you like prove there's a problem, right? And this would probably be when we're negating, like saying, yeah, like the US Department of Defense, which is like the people who do counterterrorism, like they literally are useless, which is why terrorism has increased 100% in the past 2 years, right? And with the same example of like money into counterterrorism, we can also say that the U.S. Department of Defense is severely underfunded and needs at least 100 million more dollars to be of any use in countering terrorism. So this is, an argument saying yes, we should put more money into it because the only way that we can solve for counterterrorism is by putting at least 100 million more dollars, right? So why only your side solves the problem? So that might be confusing. So the alternative also can be looking at like, oh, the US Department of Defense is crucial to counterterrorism efforts. Like we know the FBI and like the NSA and the CIA kind of also does counterterrorism, but like the Department of Defense is like the people who oversee it. So that's why the Department of Defense is like unique in our world to solving the problem of counterterrorism. The next part of an argument is a link. So it's the connection between arguments or like the connection between an argument to the resolution. So once again, going back to the counterterrorism part, the link could be that more money means that we can hire more people on the ground to be looking out for terrorists and fighting terrorism. And that links between like the resolution, which is the US should put more money into counterterrorism, and then our argument, which is that like we can look for more terrorists. And then warrant is the reasoning behind your link. So the warrant for this link would be more money means we can hire more people to look for terrorists, right? Um, like while this is pretty clear, right? More money means more people on the ground looking out for terrorists. It's not like super spelled out. So when we do really want to spell it out, we would say more money means we can actually hire more people to look for terrorists. And then the impact, I think it's pretty clear, right? It's the so what, how many people die or are saved in your world. So like, oh, every one terrorist we take off, like out of America and put into prison saves 10 lives or something like that. So that would be your impact. Okay, so now let's look at the overview of the problem. So the first problem is no link. The second is that in your like contention, all of your links are all relying on the same warranting. The third problem is there's no warranting. And the fourth problem is that there's no implication or a real impact. And the fifth problem is that the uniqueness is in the wrong direction. So let's go into detail. So the first was link level problems, right? So there's no link. So the example resolution here is the NSA should end all domestic surveillance of US citizens. So as a background, the NSA just stands for National Security Agency. And like the past like 10 years, they've been doing spying on American citizens by like taking metadata of your phone calls so they know like who you called and when you called them, right? And they like track this for all of the Americans. Um, so basically that's what the NSA does. Like it's surveilling a bunch of citizens, and the topic is like the NSA should stop that. So the contention would start at ending NSA surveillance of US citizens is bad. And then this is because the NSA currently provides crucial data to Germany and other European states, which helps them fight terrorists in their own countries. As a result, over 100 international terrorist attacks have been stopped by NSA surveillance. Okay, so you know that the problem here is that there's no link, right? So the question I'm going to ask you guys is, where is the link missing? Is it between like the NSA is bad to providing crucial data, or like this data, the link is missing between like data to help stopping terrorist attacks?
I think it's between the second and third paragraph.
So right here.
Yeah.
So it doesn't say why data like fights terrorists. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Does anyone else think there's another link that's missing?
Wait, hold up. Never mind.
Anyone? No? Okay. Well, what about like, let's look at like the resolution again, right? The NSA should end all domestic surveillance of US citizens.
Yeah, and it's talking about international level. Yeah, that was what I was gonna say.
Exactly, right? So Juliana wants to point out that there's no link between this ending US surveillance of like US citizens to this data about like terrorists in other countries, right? Like if we're surveilling people in our own country, how does this data relate to the data that's, international to fighting terrorism? So that's where we're missing the link between domestic surveillance and international surveillance. And I forgot who, like, I can't see the screen, so I don't know who talked, but I think it was like William or maybe Ethan said that like there's no link between data to stopping terrorist attacks, right? And I think while that is kind of true, it's a little bit more of a warrant problem, because we kind of talk about here, right? Crucial data stops terrorists, which has stopped 100 terrorist attacks, right? So the problem is there's no explanation. So you do have the link, which is that it does happen empirically, right? 100 terrorist attacks have been stopped by data, but we don't have the warranting for like, why does data even help stop a terrorist, right? So can we think, so the way that we would fix this problem is, let me get rid of this, is we would add like this sentence, right? Ending NSA surveillance of US citizens is bad because the NSA cannot separate domestic and international data surveillance, which means ending domestic surveillance ends international surveillance. And that's bad because the NSA provides crucial data to Germany and other states to help fight terrorists, right? So there's the actual link that was missing in the original thing. And then, like William said, right, the warrant for this instead then would be like, oh, data is crucial to like pinpointing terrorists and finding about their attacks, finding out about their attacks so we could stop them before they ever happen, right? So that would be the warrant, but the link is there. The link between surveillance and international surveillance was not there, however. All right, so how to use this in your advantage, right? So let's say now that you know that having no link is a huge problem, you can go back in your own cases and look to like solve that. But let's say your opponents don't have a link, right? So sometimes it's kind of not super obvious, right? Like it's not inherently obvious that like, oh, domestic and international surveillance are like separate, right? But when you do see that problem, it's important to like look out for the link for your opponents, right? When you do see the problem that there isn't a link, it's basically like game over in a tech round, right? Like if in their case they don't read a link between like the resolution and their argument and the impact, then you can point that out. Be like, hey, judge, they don't have a link between their argument and their impact, or like between the resolution and their impact, and don't let them bring up a new one in like rebuttal or like final focus, so like basically you can't vote for them off that contention. If it's a lay judge, obviously the lay judge, like they don't know any of the rules, so they'll be like, yeah, they can explain it later in like crossfire, right? But you can like roast them in cross, right? You can be like, oh, what's the link? Like a really basic question to ask in crossfire is like, what's the link between your argument and your impact, or like the resolution and your impact, right? And they might say one, but you can be like, oh, was that in your case? Like obviously not, right? But sometimes they also can't say one. So a lot of the reason why like people might not have links in their case is because their argument is just really sus. Like, the fact that ending US surveillance would end like international terrorist surveillance is very sus. So usually they can't like explain a link between it, right? And when that happens, you can be like, judge, they can't even explain their own argument. There's like no reason to vote off of them for this. So does anyone have a question on like not having a link? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Okay, now next, let's look at what an internal link is. So it's kind of like the baseline warranting or the reasoning behind your argument if you really boil it down. So like internal link and like internal warrant is like kind of the same, like, right? It's like the bottom line for your link. So for example, you know, your resolution right now is the US should implement price controls on the pharmaceutical industry. So, you know, one argument could be that implementing price controls would mean that there is more innovation in the market due to increased market size, which just means that like more people can buy your product, right? That's market size. So the internal warrant in like, so their link here is basically an increased market size due to price controls increases innovation, right? So the internal warrant, so their link is like, they probably titled it something like market size, right? Like link 1 is market size, but their internal warrant is actually profits, because when you have an increased market size, what happens when more people can buy your product? You earn more money. So the actual warrant is profits, right? If that's like a little bit complicated, a simpler example would be like, my parents will be disappointed if I don't go to Harvard. So what's the internal warrant? Like, why are they disappointed, right? My Asian parents wish to brag about me, and if there's nothing to brag about, that is very sad and they'll be disappointed, right? So that's really the baseline. Their disappointment stems from having nothing to brag about, not that they actually care about Harvard or something else, right? And same thing for like the pharmaceutical industry example. The innovation doesn't stem from like market size. It really stems from the increased profits due to market size. Now, the reason why this is important, I'll talk about later, but like identifying the internal link is important so you can not only understand their argument, but also refute it, right? Or like link in. So let's say my parents will be disappointed if I don't go into if I don't go to Harvard, right? And the internal warrant is that my Asian parents want to brag about something. So you can link in and you can refute the argument by saying, okay, if the problem is that they have nothing to brag about, you just have to give them something else to brag about. So like, let's say the choice is between like Harvard and like Princeton, right? Like, I feel like your parents would be pretty proud if you went to Princeton. So like, there's nothing wrong with not going to Harvard. You can go to Princeton instead, and thus we link into your argument. Your parents won't be disappointed because they can still brag about Princeton. Okay, does anyone have a question about like internal link? Okay. And similarly for like the profits warrant, right? Like if they're talking about increased market size, you can be like, oh, like to refute them, oh, but there's also like decreased profit margin, right? Like for every, you know, maybe perhaps their profit margin was like 10% before. So for every like, if the price of the good is $10, they're earning $1 for each like bottle of drugs they sell, right? But now, like, because your product is a lot cheaper, like let's say it's only $5, maybe you're only earning 50 cents for every drug that you sell, right? So you can be like, oh, that cancels each other out, and since the internal warrant is profits, like nothing happens. So now that we've talked and defined about like the internal warrant, let's talk about, you know, the problem where all of the links rely on the same internal warranting. Basically, all the basis behind the arguments are the same. So as some background, the resolution is not here, but the resolution is the US should remove sanctions on Venezuela. And as some background, basically, right now there's this guy named Maduro who's kind of a dictator in Venezuela. Like that's a country in South America. So basically, like Maduro is a dictator in Venezuela. The US put sanctions on like Venezuela because they want to stop Maduro. They want to like depose him, right? They want to take him out of office. And the US wants this guy named Guaido instead to replace him. And like, yeah, basically you have Maduro and you have Guaido, right? Like, so the U.S. wants to replace Guaido, replace Maduro with Guaido by using sanctions. And here, this case talks about why it's failing. So No. This case talks about why U.S. sanctions are good for removing Maduro. So let's see. So Maduro's government has failed Venezuela. Miguel 19 writes that while Venezuela has undergone a crisis, Maduro has failed to even acknowledge the problem. Ipatco 17 furthers that Maduro has deprived Venezuela of crucial food and medicine. So basically, we're saying Maduro sucks. Fortunately, U.S. sanctions work to pressure the Maduro regime in 3 ways. First is through drying resources. Rendon 19 explains sanctions are designed to choke off export earnings to weaken Maduro's grasp on power, undermining his ability to buy loyalty and fund illicit activities. Second, through a united front. The U.S. is pushing for a united approach, as Wilner 19 writes that the U.S. wants the European Union and Latin America to match Washington's unilateral sanctions. Unilateral just means like the U.S. is doing it alone. So bilateral would be like 2 people, multilateral would be more than 2. So this is happening now as Terry 19 writes, the US and 15 other Latin American countries passed a resolution paving way for collective action against Maduro. Third is the military. Corrales 19 of the New York Times reports Maduro utilizes the military to consolidate and control Venezuela. Fortunately, sanctions have caused the military to defect from Maduro. As Fleischman 19 reports, as a result of sanctions, the military's chain of command has broken down, causing mid and low rank men to rebel. Overall, Bloomberg 19 quantifies while 4,300 former military officers have defected, more are expected to in a domino effect. The impact is twofold. So basically, the impact is like removing Maduro.
Wait. Can you scroll back to the very top? It says that the problem is that Maduro is depriving Venezuela of crucial food and medicine. But I mean, if there's sanctions, then won't that just make the people like even more hungry, I guess?
Right. So yeah, that could be possible, but so for those of you who might be confused of what sanctions are, it's basically where the US is like, anyone who trades with Venezuela will be like, we won't trade with you, right? So like if China sells like I don't know, guns to Venezuela, the US will stop trading with China. And obviously like the US buys a bunch of stuff from other countries, so they want to avoid that, and as a result, Venezuela can't trade a lot. But the idea here is that US sanctions on Venezuela are not on food and medicine, right? Like if I was Neg, I would say that. I would say, yeah, they're on oil, which means like people can't buy oil, which is Maduro's like main way of keeping control of his power, right? So that's not the problem we're looking at right now, though. We're looking at, so what is the internal warrant for all of these 3 links, right? So the first one is sanctions are designed to choke off export earnings. So what is the link there? The internal warrant there. Okay, here, I'll give you guys a head start, okay? So this is money, right? Sanctions are
yes,
designed...
because his rule is based off of money, especially from oil, and like that's essentially the base of his power. And so by putting sanctions on this like oil and stuff, it's essentially removing like his power.
Exactly. So the internal warrant here is basically if he can't sell oil, he won't have money. So basically the internal warrant really, when it boils down to everything, is just he doesn't have money. Okay, so next is a united front of like multilateral sanctions from a bunch of countries, right? So what's the internal warrant here as well?
There will be even more countries that are putting sanctions on them. I don't know.
What's the internal warrant, right? What's the effect of people putting sanctions, more people other than just the US putting sanctions on Venezuela?
Even more likely that it's going to be even more effective in taking away his power, supposedly.
Right, and how do we take his power away?
By removing his money?
Exactly, right. So once again, the internal warrant for this one is money, because if you have more countries having more sanctions, once again, we're taking away their money. So we can see now that the first and the second link is money. So let's look at the third link, right? The military, like Maduro uses the military to consolidate and control Venezuela, but as a result of sanctions, people are defecting. So what's the internal link for why are people defecting from the military?
What does defecting mean?
Oh, like they basically say I quit and then they run away. like obviously it's not allowed that you can just like quit the military like in the middle of a fight or whatever, right? So you have to like get paperwork signed and stuff, but these people are just like, nah, I hate you, so I'm just gonna leave.
Because the military is like a way that he can kind of enforce his rule on the citizens, and so if the military is less powerful, like with like people quitting it, then that means that it will be more likely that the people could rebel and such.
Right. No, that's a great point. That's like the warranting behind why military is important, right? It's like, oh, the reasoning why military is important for Maduro is because it keeps the people in check. But what's the internal link? What's the internal warrant? Why do the military people, right? When we're looking at warrant, we're not looking for like, why does this argument make sense? Why is the military actually important? We're looking at what is the link, what actually causes the military to defect, right? We're looking at the internal link inside the link. So just as we did here, right? What is the reason, or like how does this actually impact Maduro falling down? It's through money, right? So once again, why do people defect from the military?
Perhaps it's because these like mid and like low rank military people are feeling the effects of the sanctions, and so then they're quitting. I don't know.
Exactly, right. That's really good. So they are feeling the effects of the sanctions. And the key thing to note is that these sanctions are taking away money, right? So once again, we're going back to money. When we look at the first one, right? Sanctions are designed to choke off export earnings to weaken Maduro's grasp on power by undermining his ability to buy loyalty. So what he does is he pays a bunch of people to work in his military. But now that he doesn't have money because of sanctions, people are defecting. So once again, we can see that the link in this one is money, right? So overall, really, the same link is throughout all of these. The internal link is all he has less and less money right now. So obviously, it's like not a good idea to have the same internal link, right, to all of these internal warrant for all of these link, or the internal link for all of these links, right? But how can we BS this in a round? So how can we fix this, right? First of all, obviously, in your case, you should probably try to have different links instead of like having a lot of arguments that rely on basically the same internal warrant. So you could change that. But let's say you already went into the round and you have like no other ideas to write case with, like you just have to stick with the case that you guys just saw, right? So the next question will be, how can we BS this in round to make it seem like we actually have more than one warrant, right? So for the first one, obviously it's most obviously like money, so there's no like real way to BS this one. But for the second one, how do you guys think we could word it in a different way so it's not really money anymore? Like, let's say your opponent's like, oh, isn't the internal link to like this just like them losing more money? What would you guys say?
I mean, I guess you could say that like another way that these countries could push against Maduro is by military action. So then maybe they'll group together and kind of shoot Maduro down. I don't know.
Yeah, that could be a good thing, but that would be like a separate link that you would write, because this is talking about like sanctions, right? So we have to try and BS like why else is having more countries having sanctions important other than just to funnel his money away? Okay, here, I'll give you guys some BS. Okay, so what I would say is like, oh, like right now only the US like really hates on Maduro, right? Like Maduro only really has to face the US. However, when there's like 15 other Latin American countries which are like all in the same place as Venezuela, and like when Europe also joins in on this, like Maduro will see that the whole world is against him, right? If they're all having sanctions against him, they're all professing, like they're all taking a stance, right? Like if you don't have a sanction against him and you're just like there, you kind of just like have you're neutral against like Maduro, right? You're not against or for him. However, when like 20 different countries put sanctions against Maduro, they're like actively saying like we kind of hate you as well. So Maduro will feel this pressure, and there's this like perception of like international pressure that will make him step down, or else like a bunch of bad things will happen to him. So like I think the way I would say it is that the internal warrant here would be international perception of like a bunch of countries are against you instead of like the actual money, because US sanctions are like probably enough to just take away money, right? Okay.
Perhaps it would scare his advisors and that no, like not his advisors, but like his his like workers, employees. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, you bring up a great point as well. So basically, it's that you can also say that no, the internal warrant is that not that it affects Maduro, but that it like scares away the people working for Maduro, right? Maybe before they're like, oh yes, Maduro so good, he's always gonna stay in power, and then they see like 50 different countries across the world like hate on Maduro, and they're like, oh no, maybe I should quit, so they quit, right? So that is another great point. All right, what about the military? How can we? So if they say the military is leaving because of sorry, what was I saying? Because of profits, like, oh, the internal link into the military leaving, isn't that profits? What would you guys say?
Wait, it still has to be about sanctions, right?
Yeah, it has to link back to sanctions, but sanctions can have more effects other than just like profits, right?
Maybe these people are from like maybe these people who work in the military are like from other countries maybe, and then so then like if they see that their home country doesn't like Maduro, or at least is like being really hostile towards him, then they'll leave. I don't know.
I think that could be a good argument for maybe another country, but I think for most country, actually, yeah, for most countries, I feel like a lot of their military is mostly like citizens, right? Because like you probably wouldn't want like a Russian citizen working in the US, like they're probably gonna spy on you, right? So that's probably very unlikely. Like the number of people who are actually from foreign countries is probably like 3 or 4, maybe. But when we're looking to this, another way to think about it is that like these military officers, while they might be like bribed by Maduro, right? Like they also have family, like they're also like normal people, right? Other than the fact that they kill a bunch of people, but like they also have family, and their family could be like starving or like sick because like the sanctions are like stopping food and medicine from coming in or something like that, right? So they're defecting away from Maduro. Or maybe it's like the US has sanctions on Maduro and instead they're backing up Guaido. So the military is like, oh shit, like the US loves Guaido so much, we might as well just like defect and like go support Guaido, right? So again, it's kind of like perception, but it's kind of different. So um now that we've like talked about how we can like BS this, right? Let's talk about like why it's important to identify the underlying internal link and why it's bad to have more than to have only one internal warrant. So let's say you fix your case, right? Like my case is 3 different links. The internal links are all different. But let's say your opponents really suck. They have like 3 links that are all about profits, right? If you can point out the internal link to that, like their internal link to all of their different links is the same, then you can basically take out all of their links at once by responding to just that internal warrant. So for example, if the internal link is profits, as we've identified for like the case that we just saw in the 3 different links, instead of having to respond to like, oh, what was it again? The first one was like money. Instead of having to respond to money, like a bunch of countries sanctioning people and like the military and how it's like important to Maduro, you can just respond to like the point about profits. You can be like, oh, sure, maybe sanctions like curb like his oil profits, but Maduro actually now is like mining a bunch of gold and selling it away, and like this illegal mining cannot be sanctioned because it's like illegal anyways, right? Like it's happening regardless of whether you have sanctions or not. So basically You can say that just by attacking the profits, like, oh, he still has tons of money, so sanctions don't matter, right? Or you can say like, oh, like even without sanctions, he has no money because he's so bad at like managing the economy, right? So by there, through like this one argument, you're taking out their 3 links instead of having to attack them one by one. And it's like more time efficient, so you don't have to spend like 1 minute on each link. You can just spend 1 minute responding to the internal link. It also makes you look like a genius. Like the judge will be like, "Oh, you're right. Like, wow, the internal link is the same. I didn't even notice that, right?" Yeah. So in terms of like, what is it called? The topic that you guys are prepping out, which is the pharmaceutical industry topic, it's also going to mainly link to profits, right? When we're talking about like on neg, like innovation and maybe like drug shortages, the link is always profits. So if you just block out a lot of responses to profits, right? If you just say like, oh, profits don't decrease for like 3,000 reasons, and you just read that, instead of having to respond to both contentions, you can just group it together and be like, the internal link for both of these contentions is profits, and I'm going to read you like 30,000 responses against profits, right? So then that way you don't have to like respond to it separately. You can just cross apply it. Yeah. Okay. Oh, does anyone have any questions on like internal links and stuff? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So next we're going to talk about no warranting, right? So William or Ethan pointed this out in the other one where like, how does data actually stop terrorists, right? So warranting is really the reasoning behind your link and why your link makes sense. So why it does what it does or how it links back to the resolution. And once again, we're going back to the Maduro and Guaido thing. Maduro is the current dictator. Guaido is his opponent who wants to take over, who's backed by the US. So now first let's read this and then let's identify where is the missing warranting. So contention 1 is negotiations. The Press Association 19 writes, for weeks, Maduro and Guaido's coalitions had been meeting to negotiate in a fragile process meant to resolve political turmoil in Venezuela. Overall, the best solution to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis is negotiations. Problematically, in August, Trump imposed a blanket freeze or sanction on Venezuelan assets, which caused talks to fail as Maduro halted negotiations with Guaido in protest of U.S. sanctions. Sanctions have caused negotiations between Maduro and Guaido to fail in 4 ways. First, by driving Maduro away from the table. Francisco 18 writes that sanctions have discouraged Maduro from coming to negotiations. Second, by increasing Russian influence. In response to sanctions, Russia has allowed Maduro's government to instead divert oil intended to be sold to the U.S. to Russia instead, expanding Russian influence in Venezuela. Third, by demoralizing the opposition's popular base. Rodriguez 18 writes that the people's support for Guaido has faltered. Fourth, by offering Maduro political tools. As a result of sanctions in September, Reuters 19 writes Maduro's approval rating rose 23%. So basically, what I'm saying is Maduro and Guaido were talking until Trump imposed sanctions, and then Maduro's like, nah, I hate you, Guaido, because of U.S. sanctions. And like, there's 4 links, right? First is driving him away from the table. Second, by increasing Russian influence. Third, by like stopping the support for Guaido, his opponent. And then fourth, like increasing his approval rating. So where is the warranting missing in this case?
Wait, what is warranting again? Wait, hold up.
It's like the reasoning behind it, right? So like, why does data mean less terrorism, right? Like just because you have more data, how does that stop terrorism? So in this one,
Kind of just like a link.
Yeah, it's kind of like a link, but it's more of like explaining your link, right? So you can just say your link without any explanation. Like you can just say, oh, like for example, one link could be not voting for Trump means he starts a nuclear war. That is my link. What is the warranting? Obviously, that makes no sense, right? Like, why does Trump care about my vote in the election? That would be the warranting.
Wait, so could this possibly be that just because like Maduro doesn't come, like he doesn't really say why like ending negotiations is bad, or like why his approval rating rising being bad, and other stuff. Like just why this stuff is bad, I guess. Kind of. Not sure.
Yeah, okay. So let's go link by link, right? Is there warranting missing from sanctions have discouraged Maduro from coming to negotiations? Do you guys think that it makes sense? Yes, no, maybe so.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, I guess, but it doesn't really like say why that's bad for their like case, I guess.
I would say that like negotiations is like the impact, right? Like we want negotiation, and the impact is down here. I forgot to say it, but negotiation like helps resolve the humanitarian crisis, right? So the problem is not explaining why negotiations is important. The problem here is it's just like sanctions have discouraged Maduro from coming to negotiations. Like, why? Like it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like you just assert that it happened, and we're not exactly sure why it happened, right? Okay, second, by increasing Russian influence. So basically, Maduro sells oil to Russia instead of the US. Does that make sense? Yes? No?
Wait, so what was it you said about the first one that was wrong? Like, so I can kind of
Yeah.
use it.
So the first one was, it just says sanctions have discouraged Maduro from coming to negotiation. Like, why, right? Like, we're not in. Like, you just say sanctions happen and then Maduro stops coming to negotiation. Like, that makes no sense to me, right? Like, instead, I'd probably argue that, like, sanctions encourage people to go to negotiations because now that you're running out of money, you probably want to negotiate to get the sanctions off. So the warranting is very missing there.
Oh, I thought you could just say that like a source that is smarter than you says that's true, so then it's true. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, some people do that, right? Like, they're just like, oh, I'm not sure why, but like the evidence says that, and I'm pretty sure the evidence is right, right? But that's like a horrible way to go about it. Like, you can just point out how crazy your opponents look because of that. Like, you're telling me that like Trump would start a nuclear war if I didn't vote for him just because your evidence says so. Like, who believes that, right? Like, you need to actually explain the warrant behind it. And when you don't have a warrant in the argument, it's not really an argument anymore. Like, even if your card says it, if you can't explain what your evidence says, you do not understand what your evidence is saying, right? So your evidence should probably like not be regarded as anything at all. Okay, so second, by increasing Russian influence. So does it make sense why selling Russia oil instead of the US is bad for negotiations? Yes, no? It's a yes or no answer, y'all. Does it make sense to y'all?
Wait, is this specifically negotiations between Maduro and the other country?
No.
So just negotiations in general?
Negotiations between Maduro and Guaido.
Yeah, that thing. Is it specifically
Yeah, it's
between
talking about that.
Oh.
Like, these links link into why Maduro stopped talking with Guaido.
Because
So,
like
does
selling
Russia
it to
make
Russia?
sense? Does Russia make sense to y'all? Is the warranting in the case? That's the question. Very simple answer, y'all. No,
No.
it makes like no sense. Exactly.
No.
No, because how is Russia related to Maduro and Guaido talking? Like, just because I sell oil to a country, how does that stop my negotiations, right? It doesn't say. Okay, third, people's support for Guaido has faltered. Does the warranting exist in this one?
Oh wait. No, never mind.
Yes or no? Does this make sense? People's support for Guaido has faltered, and that's bad for negotiation.
I mean, this technically doesn't say between specifically Maduro and Guaido, just the people, but like that doesn't really make sense because Maduro feels pressured by the people. Then I don't know.
I don't think there is one.
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah, right. This one makes no sense because first of all, it's missing two warrants, right? The first is how this links to sanctions, right? You don't see sanctions here, right? Third, by demoralizing the opposition's popular base. It just says people's support for Guaido has faltered, and probably because of sanctions, but we don't know why, right? Like, why does sanction make Guaido look bad? We don't know. And then the other warranting that's missing is why does Guaido looking bad to his supporters mean that he can't talk with Maduro, right? That's not inherently clear either. All right, what about the fourth one? As a result of sanctions, Maduro's approval rating rose by 23%. Does that make sense to you guys?
I guess you could say no because the approval rating doesn't really have to do with negotiations, or at least it's not really stopping his negotiations with Guaido.
That's right. Anyone else? Okay, yeah, right. And I think other than that it's not related to back to negotiations. It's also that why do sanctions increase your approval rating, right? Like, because when we think of sanctions, it's like destroying a country's economy, right? If the economy in the U.S. plummets, wouldn't I be angry at the president? Like, why would I be happy, like for Biden? Like, once he comes into office and like we all go into like massive amounts of debt, that's probably not a good thing, right? So it doesn't make sense that approval rating is increasing. So that's where we also need more warranty. Right, so now let's look at the solution to no warranting. So the basic solution in your case is to add warranting, right? So first we see that, it's discouraged Maduro from coming to negotiations by increasing the cost the government would face upon leaving power, incentivizing Maduro to dig in his heels. Basically, the argument here is like sanctions basically have taken away his savings. So if he like left, probably a lot of people would like want to kill him or something, right? And like he has no way of protecting himself, and he also doesn't have any money, so he probably just wants to stay in power. Second, by expanding Russian influence. So after they now sell oil to Russia instead of the U.S., as long as Russia has a stake in the Maduro government, Elliot 19 writes, they'll do whatever they can to stop a regime change by an outside force, which like such as the U.S. allowing Guaido to take power, right? So basically, Russia is influencing like Venezuela now, and like Russia has another like country which is their puppet, right? And like obviously they don't want like the puppet to change because their puppet is Maduro. So let's say like if the US puts in Guaido, then this country becomes kind of like the US's puppet, right? So it gives Russia a reason to not want to let Guaido to take power, which probably means that Russia will be like, hey, Maduro, like, don't go into talks, right? Third, by demoralizing the opposition's popular base, and Guaido's support has faltered as they view sanctions as a demonstration that the opposition cares more about removing Maduro from power than the people's welfare. So basically, it makes Guaido look bad because Guaido keeps like trying to like take Maduro out of power as control to like as compared to like helping the people first, right? So he should probably be like handing out money instead of like talking with Maduro or something.
Oh, I thought Guaido was a country.
No. Guaido. So once again, right? Maduro is like the dictator, and then Guaido is the person who the U.S. wants to replace Maduro with.
Oh, I thought it was like a separate country, like leader or something.
That would make sense. Yeah. Fourth, by offering Maduro political tools. So the Washington Office on Latin America 19 reports sanctions give Maduro a political scapegoat to blame their poor economic situation, allowing him to hold popular support, which is why his approval rating rose 23%, right? So there's the warranting. Basically, like the economy was already like really bad before sanctions, right? Like Maduro kind of like sucked at managing the economy. But after sanctions, he was like, oh yeah, it's all the US's fault. It's not me. So then they're like, oh yeah, I hate the US. Like, oh yeah, go Maduro, right? So you get like this sense of nationalism, and people like love Maduro more, which is why his approval rating rose. So this is why like warranting is so important, right? Like obviously when I read this case to you, y'all were like, what the hell? It makes no sense, right? But now that we have the warranting, it makes a lot more sense to not only like your like to yourself, but also your judges, right? Or else like your judges listening to this would be like, what? And you probably maybe you want to think like, hey, it's good to confuse my opponents. Like they have no idea what's happening, right? They'll probably figure it out, but the people who won't figure it out are like your judges, right? So it's a lot better to have warranting than to not. And your opponents can also say like, hey, they didn't have warranting, don't let them bring this up later, and then you'll be like kind of screwed. But let's say you made a mistake and you didn't realize that you had no warranting, and you're like stuck with this case in your round, right? What you would try to do is explain it in like crossfire or in summary at least, or even rebuttal. You know, you can like go back to your own case and kind of bring up the warranting. So a lot of the time when people don't understand your case, they'll usually ask like, oh, what's the link, or like, what's the warranting for your first link or your second link, right? And that's a great place where you can try to re-explain your whole case and fill in all the words that you didn't say. So how can we use this to our advantage? Let's say we have warranting, they don't, right? In a tech round, you can point it out and tell the judge. You'll be like, hey, judge, they don't have warranting in their case. Don't let them bring it up later. That's abusive. Yeah, and then basically they kind of like it, like the judge has less of a reason to vote for them, right? But if it's a lay judge, obviously lay judges don't understand like abuse or like why it's unfair if they bring up the warranting later. You can still point it out and like talk about how it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, oh, my opponent said in their case that Russia, like Maduro selling oil to Russia means that negotiations fail. Obviously, that makes no sense at all, right? And then you can point it out to the judge, and the judge will be like, oh yeah, it makes no sense. And they'll be like, because like obviously lay judges like love things that make sense. And usually when people don't have a warrant, it's usually because they don't understand the warrant, right? The same thing for the link. Like if your argument is sketchy and you don't have a link, it's probably because you can't find a link. If your argument is sketchy and you don't have a warrant in it, it's probably because you don't understand the warrant. So that's why you can usually ask them in crossfire and like roast them and make them look really bad and be like, judge, my opponents came and like explain their own case. You have no reason to vote off of them, right? Okay, does anyone have questions on this part?
Wait, what if you're writing a case and you understand like how it logically works, like kind of like hypothetically, but you can't find evidence?
Well, if you can't find evidence, you can like, obviously there's not always going to be evidence like, oh, every 1% price control leads to like 3 million people more dying, right? Like in that case, the first thing I would try to do is find general evidence that says like more price controls lead to more people dying, right? Like maybe or even like less profits for companies means less people dying, right? And you kind of find general cards that kind of frame your argument in a way that makes sense, right? So let's say like in the pharmaceutical one, you're trying to prove that like price controls would mean that there's a lot of drug shortages in the industry. And you think it makes sense, right? If companies are running out of money, they're probably having no money to produce the drugs. And as a result, people are obviously going to die if they can't get access to medicine. Let's say you can't find the evidence that says that like price controls would lead to drug shortages. Instead, what you can find is that like when profits decrease, you know, companies go out of business. And obviously when companies go out of business, you know, they can't make the drugs anymore. And then you just have to find evidence that says price controls means less profits, which is, you know, pretty inherent out there. Then you can kind of explain your case. In the worst case scenario, like you can't find any cards, I would say you can make like an analytic, but in case we really want to have cards, like a lot of lay judges are like very evidence-based. Yeah, so I would say it's a lot better to have even some general cards than no cards. And if you can't find cards, either look harder or like give up on the argument. And instead you can read it in rebuttal, right? You can read it as like a dissat on their case, like just apply it as an analytic, because your rebuttals usually don't have to, like they don't have to have evidence if they make a lot of sense, right? There's that. Any other questions? Okay. All right, here's a beautiful quote from an expert, which is me. If you don't have a link in your case, you suck and you should lose. If you don't have warranting in your case, you're not careful enough. If you have similar warranting, you better be a hella good debater and be good at BS. Anyways, let's move on. All right, the next major problem in case is like fake impacts or no implications, right? Like what I mean by fake impacts is the impact doesn't link to a human impact, right? So in this case, we can see that like The resolution is the U.S. should adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use. So we talked about this before, but basically, like the U.S. has a bunch of nukes, right? And we can use them first before, even if no one attacks us. But if we adopt no first use, that means someone has to nuke us first because before we can nuke them, right? And basically, the problem is right now there's a lot of miscalculation due to this first use policy. But by taking it off, like by using a no first use policy, we're going to decrease miscalculation. The impact is a Southern Pacific arms race, as Chinese proliferation would lead to a regional arms race, as Gadapolus 20 finds that Japan and Australia would feel threatened for China's growing power. Problematically, Kleiner 16 finds a new nuclear arms race would be even riskier than that of the Cold War, as Japan, South Korea, and North Korea would be drawn in. So, what is the impact in the case that we see right now?
A Southern Pacific arms race?
Exactly, right. So basically, like in that region, there's going to be an arms race with nukes. What is wrong with the impact, right? Like, let's look specifically at this last card. It would be a new nuclear arms race would be even riskier than that of the Cold War. What's wrong with that impact?
Wait, because the Cold War didn't result in any death? Maybe? I don't know.
That could be one impact, yes. That could be one problem. What else? What else? Okay, what does it mean when something is riskier than the Cold War? Like, how many people are going to die?
A lot. Like, people are going to die from, like, nuclear weapons, right?
Right. And like, how many people? Right, we don't know. And what does even riskier mean? Like, how much riskier than the Cold War? Why is having nuclear arms race bad? Like, how does that lead to a nuclear war, right? Like, I feel like the impact right here is very confusing. And really, it's really like, it's going to be riskier than the Cold War, which kind of killed nobody and didn't really matter, right? So what would be a better impact here?
If there's a war, then there will be more people who could use nuclear weapons.
Right, and then what's a even better impact?
How many people would die?
Exactly, right. So like if a nuclear war happened, 100 million people would die, right? That would be a super spicy impact. So when I talk about implicating the impact, it just means like from the impact, you're going to extrapolate it or you're going to link it to an impact that affects like the average person, right? So a risky Cold War scenario, how does that impact the average person? Like if that is my impact, we have no idea how that impacts the average person, right? What we want to do is we want to link it back to human lives, right? So like let's say it's an economic impact. The US will go into a recession. What's the impact of recession? People go into poverty. That's what you want, right? Or the US will lose $500 billion. What's the impact of $500 billion? People lose their jobs, right? That's a human impact. What we don't have here is a human impact. How many people would die? What does risky mean for the average person, right? So here's the solution to the fake impact. So a nuclear arms race would be even riskier than that of a Cold War. Kronig 15 asserts that nuclear proliferation leads to a use it or lose it situation where states feel the need to strike first with nukes, leading to a catastrophic nuclear war. And this is also bad because Gibler 05 finds arms races increase the chance of war by 5-fold. According to Russell 20, the US-China Cold War could materialize in the form of proxy wars in Taiwan, South China Sea, or Hong Kong. And then a US-Chinese conflict could turn nuclear, which would kill over 2 billion people, right? So now we have implicated it into 2 billion people dying. That's like a third of the world population, which is like insane, right? But now we see that why this impact is a lot stronger than just like, oh, the Cold War is kind of risky, right? Does that make sense to you?
Wait, it's saying the problem with the nuclear war is from famine rather than the actual nuclear weapon?
Yeah.
I guess that actually kind of makes sense.
Yeah. No, because well, there's this thing called like nuclear winter where basically like you nuke the US or like you have a nuclear war and then there's like a lot of like dust and like soot that goes into like the air and then it like reflects all the sunlight out of the US, out of the earth, right? So like all the sunlight goes away, and like we need sunlight for our plants. So then like all the plants are going to die, and then it's going to kill like 2 billion people. But anyways, that's besides the point, right? It's just like I'm just showing you guys how like a people impact is a lot better than like, oh, Cold War is kind of risky, right? And why this is important is because like when we're weighing our impacts, when we're comparing the impacts at face value, right? Let's say you're looking to my case, which is risky Cold War, to a like impact on their case, which is 100 million people dying. Like, how do you weigh that, right? Like, oh, it's riskier than the Cold War, which didn't kill anyone, but could have killed a lot of people. But we also don't know how many people, as compared to 100 million people dying on their case, right? So it's a lot easier. Or even when you're like comparing risky Cold War to like the economy is damaged, right? How do you weigh those two? We're not sure. But when we have human lives, it's a lot easier to outweigh everything, right? Because usually the general agreement is that like lives are more important than anything else, right? Lives are more important than money because the economy can recover, or like lives is more important than like, you know, international relations, because like when the people are dead, they're dead, right? Like you can always fix your relations with other countries, or you can fix your economy, or you can lift people out of poverty. But when they die because like a nuclear war that causes a huge famine, like those lives aren't going to come back. So that's why we always want to link back to humans, because it's really the easiest way to weigh your case against other people. Does anyone have questions there? Okay. Next. So basically, if you don't have an implication, it's too easy to outweigh you, and that's the same for your opponents, right? We talked about weighing. So the next problem that we see is wrong uniqueness. So the resolution, once again, we're going back to, this is kind of confusing, sorry, but like I didn't have the perfect cases for all these. The NSA should end all domestic surveillance of US citizens, right? So remember, the NSA is spying on US citizens right now. So contention one is domestic terrorism. Basically, domestic terrorism is the single greatest threat to the US. Since the Charlottesville KKK rally, targeted hate crimes have spiked 23%, but the NSA collects metadata to stop these terrorist attacks. The impact is lives, as Ruse 20 quantifies, racial hate crimes have tripled, with violent killing growing ninefold. Ending NSA surveillance would be catastrophic, as CTED 20 finds domestic terrorists are now using conspiracy theories and disinformation related to COVID-19 to increase recruitment 800%. This is bad, as Bergen 17 finds one large-scale terrorist plot can kill thousands. So what is wrong with the uniqueness here? And once again, like uniqueness is like, you know, what is the problem? Why is the problem really bad? Or why is only our side like solving the problem? Okay, so let's go back. So what is the point of this contention? What is it saying? What does NSA data do? Am I glitching or is someone else glitching? Okay, well, let's look back here, right? The NSA's collection of key metadata enables law enforcement to take preemptive action to mitigate the effects of covertly planned terrorist attacks. So what is this resolution trying to say?
Wait, this thing is supposed to be covertly planned, but like it's killing, it's like large scale? I don't know. Because like in the bottom it says that it's a large scale.
No, covertly means secretly planned. So
Yeah.
obviously, like when you're a terrorist, you're not gonna like be like,
Oh yeah.
you're not gonna be like, hey, I'm gonna kill you tomorrow, right? You're gonna be like, secretly, I'm gonna kill a bunch of Americans, right? So that's what.
Yeah, sorry. I thought you meant like covertly like done. I don't know.
Yeah.
Ah. No. Sorry.
So what is this contention trying to say?
So if you spy on people, you can find out if they're like planning anything like attacks. So
Right, exactly. Right. So we can stop terrorist attacks and we can stop terrorists. So this idea is saying we can stop terrorists. Now the uniqueness is trying to define the part, like the argument, or why your side is solving for it, or why only your side is solving for it, right? So what's wrong with the uniqueness here? Right. Racial hate crimes have tripled. Recruitment increased 800%. Targeted hate crimes spiked 23%. What's wrong with saying these things? So we're saying we're solving for terrorists, right? What's wrong with saying hate crimes have increased? Or terrorist crimes have increased? It's like pretty straightforward, right? Like if we are claiming that terrorism has gone down, and let's remember, actually you guys don't know this, but the NSA has been around for like 50 years. It's been spying on people for like 50 years, right? If they've been spying on people for 50 years, why are there more terrorists? And why are more people being killed than ever from terrorists? Right? So that just shows the uniqueness is going in the wrong direction, right? So you're saying we are the only ones that solve for terrorists, and then there's a lot more terrorists that you're not solving for. So like, are you really solving for terrorism? Probably not, right? Especially if they're increasing so much.
Oh, so it's saying that like currently, even though the NSA is like supposedly actively monitoring against this, it's still increasing, like 94
Exactly.
more than 800%.
Right. Like if it's increasing 800%, like what is the NSA doing? Probably nothing. So, so there's the question, like, what is the difference between what we are claiming to do and the status quo? So they're claiming that they stopped these terrorists, but terrorism has increased 800%. Like, you're probably wrong, right? So how do we fix the uniqueness? So the easiest way would be to delete the bad stuff, right? You just delete all of these cards that say terrorism has increased. But obviously, we still want uniqueness in our own case, right? You want to find different cards proving the right direction of uniqueness. So in that case, we would want to find evidence that said terrorism is actually rapidly decreasing in the status quo, right? Like we've saved like 300 million lives and there's less and less terrorists. Or like, let's say you didn't realize this because in the round, you can completely ignore it and pretend it never happened and just try to save yourself in the middle of the round. It's a bad idea, but this is the worst case scenario. What I would do is I would say, yeah, it's like a scalar impact, right? Like they're using more conspiracy theories to increase recruitment by 800%, but why haven't more people died? Because the NSA stops the terrorist attacks. Like you can become a terrorist if you want, but the NSA can't stop you from that. But they can stop you from killing people, and that's why people haven't died, right? That's what I would say, or I would say something like, yeah, it's like a scalar impact, which just means like every little bit is good, right? Although hate crimes have increased 23%, although more people have died by 23%, it would have been like 50% without the NSA, right? But yeah, so that's how I would like save myself from the uniqueness. I would just like weasel out of it, but don't try to do that, right? So let's talk about now, why is uniqueness important to identify? So many people actually overlook like the uniqueness, right? But it can literally take out your case. So this exact wording, I ran it in every single tournament during this topic, right? And nobody, like only one team pointed it out of like the 20 teams I went against, like only one team actually noticed it, right? So that's where you see that like there's a lot of flaws in law arguments that people don't actually catch. But when you do catch it, it's really easy, right? Like this can take out your entire contention because you don't have to attack the links. You don't have to attack the arguments. You don't have to like, sure, we agree, metadata, sure, maybe it can take out terrorists. But the matter of fact is that it's not really doing anything, right? Or it isn't doing enough because terrorism has increased 800%. You just like took out your own argument. You're contradicting yourself, right? So when you point that out, not only do you look smart, they also look dumb. So it's almost kind of like terminal defense because there's no way for them to respond to it. Like, what are they going to say? Like, oh, yeah, like recruitment has increased 800%, but it's like not that bad. Like, we still stopped like one terrorist attack. Like, great, you're not doing much, right? And like, it just kind of disproves their case. And you can also roast them in cross, right? Like, you can ask them this question, like, if the NSA is so good, why are there more and more terrorists and people dying from terrorists, right? And then they'll sound like really dumb.
Wait, but is having like no NSA like worse than, I mean like, yeah, worse than having an NSA? Because like even if they only stop like one terrorist attack, then like wouldn't that still save like several people?
Right, you can say that, but the problem is your opponents can also implicate, right? If the NSA exists and while the NSA exists, terrorism is going up, like maybe the NSA could be causing this terrorism, right? Like it just goes to show it's not doing much, and it probably could be causing, like, let's say you say there's a, like, back to the Venezuela, right? There's sanctions on Venezuela and a bunch of people are starving to death there, right? You say there's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, but the sanctions are going to solve for it, right? If there's 100 million people dying at the same time there are sanctions, there's probably something wrong with uniqueness, right? Like, you are probably the ones causing this 100 million people dying, right? So when you have these two things at like the same time, you kind of like disprove yourself, right? Obviously that wasn't a perfect example though. There's probably like better examples that you will see in like debate, but I'll definitely see that. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, well, here we go. It's better to not include uniqueness in your case than to have bad uniqueness, right? Because bad uniqueness can take out your own case, whereas no uniqueness just makes your case kind of weak. But if you ignore uniqueness and you don't want to like put it in just because you don't want to make a mistake, that's a bad idea, right? You want to include your uniqueness because it's still a pretty important part of your case. All right, so that was it for today. Does anyone have any remaining questions about like any point?
No, but it seems like, just like a comment, it seems like you worked quite hard on the PowerPoint, so thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I did. Oh, that validation is all I need.
Sorry, but I was kind of like clueless for like half the case. Like it's kind of just like right in front of me, and I'm just like, what?
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's like pretty confusing, but I feel like when you guys watch more debates and when you practice debates, like this will surface in your brain one day. You'll be like, oh, that's what Nicole was talking about. But yeah, we'll definitely be working a little bit more on this next time. So I will put the PowerPoint in the resources channel. So if you go into like the teams and then under resources, in the top tab, you'll see files. I'm gonna put it under case. So there's different folders. This one's called, actually it's called constructive. So I'm gonna put it under constructive and y'all can find this PowerPoint here. And then next week we're gonna be doing like some practice on this. So yeah, I'll see y'all next week. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.